Great. Thank you so much, Susan. Really appreciate your comments on that. And Naureen, are you there?
Yes, I am indeed. And
Okay.
I'm somewhat nervous now to speak because anything I might have thought I would say, Susan said. And I have the added disadvantage of the phone. So I tried to scribble along a response to the presentation. So please bear with me if actually reading my own handwriting is quite terrifying. But thank you so much for letting me join, and it's a real honor to be there, at least virtually. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, and I hope you can hear me clearly. I'm bearing with a bit of a cold, so if I'm going too fast or unclear, please let me know.
You're good, so thank you.
And so, okay, well, thank you, and I'm going to then riff a little, to borrow Susan's term, I'm going to riff a little bit on also what she said and comment a little bit more on the CBE policy and program side. We at the Global Center noticed about 3-4 years ago when CBE, or countering violence extremism, was sort of emerging out of the rubric on prevention, emerging out of a concern that many organizations had and certainly still have, that the response to terrorism and violent extremism was limited to a security response, and that there seemed to be very little space for what we would call a much more comprehensive or holistic approach that took into account prevention. And so certainly we saw reflected in the UN's Global Counterterrorism Strategy in 2006, a first time that countries at a very high level even acknowledged that the push and pull factors, the root causes of terrorism, or what the UN now calls the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, were acknowledged even to be a part of the problem. It sounds somewhat incredulous right now, but it was a very difficult conversation. And so fast forward to the emergence sort of CBE, and we noticed very much that this recognition of the different kinds of roles that women can play and all the important work that Susan just outlined on 1325, and the lessons learned from working with women in communities and conflict and peace building, none of that seemed to be filtering into the discussion about CBE policies and programs. Much of the programming and the policies reflected the assumptions and biases that have already been mentioned, that women are victims, women did not seem to be spoken of as having any kind of agency, so any choices they might make, whether they support ISIL or Al-Qaeda, were seen as some irrational act that we must quickly rationalize and sort out for them. And we noticed that as, sitting here in New York, a lot of my work is UN facing. A lot of my face, thank God you can't see right now, but a lot of my work is UN facing. And we saw here that as governments supported the gathering of lots of different UN entities to come and give their input to addressing terrorism and violent extremism, there were sort of 30 different entities gathered together for this. Nowhere in there was there a discussion of gender or women, and certainly not with any kind of a nuance that reflects all the lessons learned that Susan highlighted. And so in 2012, which now feels like a lifetime ago, we put together a discussion trying to bring together UN women with the counterterrorism actors at the UN. And this reflected a lot of discussions we saw in many of our government partners as well. So I think it's a useful illustrative example to look at the UN. And we saw that there had been no discussions between UN women, between the counterterrorism actors, and there was very little recognition that this was in fact a gap to be filled. And we had called, in fact, for UN women to join this task force as a means of trying to systematize a little bit a consideration of gender. We worked with the Security Council to try and bring a gender perspective into their mandates, into their discussions about programming. This is very difficult because not only were we talking about issues like gender, which is, very, for most part, security actors seen as the soft of the soft, but CBE itself has had and certainly still has a number of skeptics, and in the face of groups like ISIL and Al-Qaeda that pose a keen threat to international security, there wasn't and isn't always an appetite to hear about preventive approaches or more broader approaches in the hard security response. And I think part of the challenge was that at the same time, as CVE evolved, there has been an effort to differentiate CVE from CP. And for those of you not that familiar with the acronym, we've tried to differentiate the two practices. When we talk about counterterrorism, we're often talking about a much more militarized, kinetic security response that we're probably more familiar with cops and law enforcement, military and surveillance. And when we're talking about CVE, the big change in the approach, or supplemental change to the approach, has been the inclusion of community engagement, of gender, of preventive approaches that look at education, at strategic communications, at civil society activism, as a means of developing a much more sustainable and I would say locally resonant approach to terrorism prevention. So in many ways, CVE was itself new, and it was and is a hard sell at times. And then you add to that a discussion of gender in an environment that is already skeptical of it. Just getting inclusion of gender and a recognition that this would be an important topic has been a struggle. And so, at least in the last 3 years, I will say that on the sort of semantic side of policies, and in terms of looking at the mandates, the good practices, the policy emphasis in the CVE or counterterrorism space, there has been quite a lot of change in terms of recognizing that women in CVE is an important and has been a neglected subject. And I think part of that challenge, of course, comes from a need to look for operational ways in, but there has been some recognition that the different roles women play are something we don't quite understand. As Susan mentioned, the migration or the travel of women to go join ISIL is very different because they're not joining for not only for not being fighters, but many of the other fighting groups that were recruiting women, like the Maoists in Nepal, for example, or the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, were offering women more liberal space than they already had in their communities. Women joining the Maoists operated in a much more, or theoretically, more liberal environment than did many of the women they left behind at home. And what is different, of course, about ISIL, and many of us looking at it, is ISIL is not offering necessarily a space for more liberal growth. And so I think we do need a lot more research and a lot more understanding as to why women in countries where they have better access to education, they have access to services, their rights are at least protected by law, are choosing to travel. And I think that leads us to a very important question as to how do we better address and understand the ISIS narrative, or groups like ISIS. Many of them are operating on the same ideology, because as was highlighted, they are speaking a language of state building. They are looking to create a just society, and in that there is a very important role for women, as they are, they're putting it. They're far better at making the case for themselves in this, and they are offering a kind of empowerment and liberalism that clearly the number of women that are going to join them do not feel that they have. And I think there is some recognition, at least among a number of governments and policymakers, that here's something we weren't prepared for, we didn't understand. And policymakers and governments are often the worst interlocutors at telling a 14-year-old girl what's hot and what's not, and why she should or should not like it. So we're in somewhat new policy terrain. We at the Global Center have been trying to address this challenge in two different ways. One is having CVE programs or CVE policy work that focuses specifically on sort of engaging women or families and communities. And we've done quite a lot of work in trying to raise the profile of these issues and shine a light among counterterrorism practitioners on the need for these approaches. But we ourselves have also, as Susan was saying with USAID, tried to mainstream that into our programming. So whether we're looking at criminal justice rule of law training, or whether we're looking at informing and researching CBE policy and practice, or whether we're looking at anti-money laundering and terrorist financing projects, we ourselves inculcate a gender perspective throughout, looking at not only access to the programs themselves, so that we make sure, at least in terms of our programs, women and girls, boys as suitable, have access to it, but also that in the design and sort of rollout of these programs, we understand the gender dimension, and we try as much as possible in terms of evaluating the impact or considering the impact of these programs to take a gender dimension. So that twin approach on having sort of specific projects or initiatives looking at women in CBE, and then just making sure that that is mainstreamed into all our work. We have a unique opportunity often to try and convene meetings with unusual stakeholders. A lot of civil society groups work either purely with civil society or government, or have a single focus. We've been able to be in a position to bring together government, civil society, and other practitioners, both at the multilateral level, so working at sort of the UN level or other intergovernmental bodies like the Global Counterterrorism Forum, but also working with regional organizations and then at the very local level with civil society groups. And a lot of what we've tried to do as a first effort is to try and change the narrative and the sort of sensitization to this issue, and to change the narrative about how they look at the roles of women. I remember several years ago, people would say, oh yeah, we should have a program on women as TV, like women as victims, right? And, it was really disheartening to constantly hear that refrain that CBE programming that focuses on women was about victims. Or that, women were always sort of powerful in their voices as victims, or, as you said, sometimes as mothers, which is of course important, but there was very little attention to understanding why women are perpetrators. And then certainly I would say on the more granular level, there almost seems more comfort with talking about women in CBE at a sort of abstract policy level, but then translating that into the nuts and bolts of gender, the gender lens and actual programming, that seems to come last. So we've tried to work with governments and civil society and bring them into one space through CBE trainings or specialized thematic workshops to try and look at thinking about CBE differently from CT, and making the case that if you want real, sustainable, and I use this term again, locally resonant programming, that you absolutely need not only civil society, but you will need women on board. CBE is a very different space from CT. You're dealing with the realm of culture, emotion, perception, relationships, very, very sort of intimate relationships between families and community members, and to not have women included in the discussion is a huge flag. And it's from an effectiveness point of view, it also makes very bad common sense. Makes for a lack of common sense in CBE programming. So our first step has been trying to also sensitize some frontline officials who are much more used to dealing with hard security, hard CT approaches on the gender dimension in CBE. But I think it speaks also to a bigger question beyond CBE. I mean, the Global Center's focus is primarily on civilian approaches to addressing threats like terrorism and violent extremism. But what we are also seeing more broadly is that some of these groups are changing the nature of conflict, and I think testing some of our traditional tools in dealing with it. I say quite often, again, sitting here in New York around the UN, that Baghdadi is not fighting for a seat in the General Assembly, nor does ISIS respect the blue helmet. A lot of the mediation and prevention tools that were designed for armed conflict are not necessarily designed for groups that wholly reject the international system. And so part of the conversation we've also been trying to have is trying to move CBE only out of sort of a narrow counterterrorism lens and think about prevention in relation to armed conflicts that increasingly have an interlinked dimension of organized crime. The lines between rebel, insurgent, terrorist, extremists are blurring in a number of locations. And so the very siloed approach we have to dealing with conflict, which was, certainly the preventive diplomacy folks and the CVE folks and the women, peace and security teams, I can say certainly in New York, at the UN level and at many governmental levels, did not speak to each other. So one of the areas of work we're also trying to focus on at the Global Center is to try and break down some of these silos and see how we can leverage the lessons learned. CVE is a new area of practice, but it's not a blank slate. All the lessons learned from peace building, from working with women, peace and security, all the lessons learned from conflict prevention actually needs to be the basis for CVE, and too often they're not because the right opportunities to engage the different bureaucratic machinery are not in place. And so a lot of the work we are focusing on and we see as critical to going forward is building a much more integrated approach that allows for the development of policies that are cognizant of the gender dynamics of conflict, that bring to bear the lessons learned, that allow for gender voice and for women's voices, not only in the response stage, but in sort of the early conceptualization stage of policies and programming. In that, I think that, at least from where I sit, it looks like we're just at the beginning, but at least we have seen a change in the CVE space in terms of government mandates and areas of interest. We see increasing recognition of the roles of women or the need to better understand them. And I think, the numbers issue is important. Yes, they're definitely smaller numbers, and that helps. Unfortunately, some of the biases and assumptions appear to be reinforced because they say, look, it's not a large number of women who are trying to fight, ergo our biases are confirmed. But I think what's very important when we look at the recruitment patterns for these kinds of groups and the advent sort of social media and the much more visible role women are playing in social media that they might not have otherwise played in communities, is that a lot of men and boys might be traveling because of incitement by women. The impact of women incitement is not necessarily just manifested itself in the numbers of women traveling, but also on the motivations of drivers of men traveling, and we just don't know enough about it. There is some good initial research on it, but it's definitely an area where we need to better understand it. And at the same time, if we look at a number of the push and pull factors, the governance deficit, the crises of identity or lack of access to employment and education, we could actually ask the question, in fact, why there aren't many more terrorists than what we already have, because so many citizens in many parts of the world are grappling with these questions. And so I think an important question we also need to ask ourselves is what roles are women playing, or what is the gender dynamics in countries where there isn't a widespread violent extremist threat, or countries that are in rough regional neighborhoods where extremist groups are operating, that appear to have, until now at least, been resilient to the challenge. And certainly the anecdotal evidence a lot of people in those countries offer is that where women have more opportunity to be publicly engaged in civil society and in shaping sort of rights and liberties, that there's a beneficial effect on resilience, and it would be great to have more research and empirical data on things like that. So I think in terms of my remarks, I will leave it there just to say that there's been some positive change at the policy level, but we see that change on the practical level comes more slowly. So at the Global Center, we'll continue to work with international organizations, regional partners, local partners, NGOs, and hopefully all of you to keep this going. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Naureen, for your contributions. I think both you and Susan have done an excellent job at really portraying how complex the situation is and how much more we really need to learn in this space. So it does sound like it's very nascent, but at least we're beginning to have these dialogues and beginning to get some of the research. I'm going to let Susan have the first question as a panelist. So please, Susan, go.
Naureen, can you talk about the pros and cons of having CTE versus CVE instead of having them more together as one topic? And specifically the gender impact that that has.
It's kind of the million-dollar question. I'll do my best to try and offer at least my one humble perspective on it. The benefits of having CT and CVE is I think there's a danger to having the very hard kinetic counterterrorism approaches without offsetting it with some of the prevention and some of the, it's a weird space. Some of the de-radicalization and rehabilitation conversation gets pulled in under CVE. So I'd say the spectrum of activities under what is broadly called CVE, to not have those in the CT space, I think means that we'll be back to square one where we're doing sort of pinprick counterterrorism responses, but all you do is take out the immediate threat and not actually look at the sort of shifting ideological dynamics or the potential for future challenges to be there. So I think that's one of the benefits to having it together. The challenge of having them purely together is, and as we've seen in many governments, you have the right arm doing CT and the left arm doing CVE, and the two are very contrary to one another. So you're encouraging communities to come forward and to share their knowledge and expertise or share the threats they might identify, and then you have a law enforcement response that is wholly disproportionate and then discourages further engagement and cooperation. Or you talk about CVE and human rights in one space, and then in the CT space, the human rights dimension is completely left out, and so you end up looking like, you're talking at cross purposes, and you lose the trust of your stakeholders. So I think that's what the pros is, that they should be together, and you need a balanced approach to CT. The cons are that when the two are not done in a coordinated manner, there's a danger that CT actually negatively impacts the space for CVE. And in that, I would say the gender dimension. I mean, if you're conducting hard-nosed CT without a gender lens to it, but you're trying to promote a gender lens on CVE, the two will be counterproductive. Why they're helpful being separate, I think, because if we look at some of the nature of the groups, violent extremism doesn't just result in terrorism. It's fueling sectarian conflict, it's threatening social cohesion, it's keeping girls out of schools in places where their families really want them to go to schools, even though they're very conservative societies. And so I think in trying to delegitimize or challenge, the appeal of extremist groups or their power or their narrative, it has a benefit beyond countering terrorism, but to it can have a benefit to supporting development or preventing further tensions and conflict. And so I think in some ways, while CTE sort of born out of the CT family, done well, that kind of prevention should be able to help offset some potential challenges that may not always manifest themselves in terrorism, but it might be, as I said, other forms of social tension or sectarian strife. And so I think CVE, in a way, can be a benefit not only to those looking to prevent and mitigate terrorism, but a broader sort of conflict prevention effort. Does that help?
We should remind the slow learners of CPE and CTE.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I can't hear that.
The question was that if you could please remind the folks the difference between CVE and CTE, just to kind of review those again.
CT was counterterrorism, and CVE is countering violent extremism. And CT is much more associated with the sort of law enforcement military response to terrorism, as we are more probably familiar with it from CVE. And that CVE, countering violent extremism, is much more the prevention side of it, working with communities, and it's somewhat the hard power, soft power difference.